Climate, the all-encompassing term that defines the state of the world around us. Climate change, the idea that the global climate patterns are shifting. How can we as a society prevent from causing catastrophic impacts on the global climate? What will happen if we don't? The climate experiment.
Hello, everyone. Climate. Nick, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing all right, man. So this is kind of a special topic, huh? Special experiment kind of hits home for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if all the listeners know, but I am a civil engineering and environmental engineering double major at UC Davis, now graduate, which is crazy to think about. I'm done.
Yeah, you're done.
Yeah. But this topic has been presented many times in the classroom for me. And then it's also something I've researched kind of on the side just because I'm interested in it. And I think it's very important. So it'll be the topic of today's discussion. And I hope that you listeners and Adonis, you guys walk out of this knowing more than before you clicked play.
All right, sounds good. So to begin, climate change, right? If you could give a 1-minute summary, quick summary, just to kind of break the ice, no pun intended, about climate change. Take it away.
Yeah. So first, I want to start with defining climate. So the climate, contrary to a lot of people's belief or interpretation, is the state of the world, specifically the atmosphere around us, on average globally. So it's not, oh, it's raining today. The climate is rainy. That's more just weather. So climate is an overall condition of the state of the planet. Now, climate change is the idea that this state of the planet is not stagnant. It changes and varies across time and given certain conditions. The popular discussion of climate change is the impact that human activities, often defined as anthropogenic, I'll probably use that term a couple times. That just means man-made activities, are having a severe impact on the climate, and that it's getting to the point where our activities are irreversible, and that we are going to have to make some major changes to avoid catastrophic levels of change that will, in the end, impact or be the demise of humanity.
All right. That was a mouthful. I love it. So, okay. So let me ask you, let me pose a question here. And it's kind of a simple one. We're going to go into this a little easy. What are some proofs that humans are the cause, or I don't want to say cause, because the whole argument is that climate change occurs regardless of human interaction or not, right? But the thing is here that humans are accelerating the process of the change in climate. Is that something that's agreed upon in the climate community?
Yeah. So basically, if you look at graphs of global temperatures, a term that's been coined in this whole climate change discussion is global warming. It's a term I think some people are more familiar with, but it really doesn't encapsulate all the effects of climate change. But yes, global warming is something that we see as a result of climate change. And if you look at the temperatures, the average annual temperature of Earth from the time of the Industrial Revolution, which is when we started taking out all these fossil fuels from the ground and burning them to, run our everyday lives, power everyday lives, create electricity, get us around places through vehicular and other forms of travel. So if you look at the moment of the Industrial Revolution until now, there's been an exponential increase in the average temperature of the Earth. And so that is not simply a coincidence or one of Earth's, normal cycles of getting warmer or cooler. It is a direct impact of our burning of fossil fuels and releasing millions and millions of metric tons of CO2 into the air.
Got it. And so one of the arguments that is kind of made, because we have to look at this regionally, right? Like we have to look at it. Okay, U.S. How much CO2 does U.S. emit? How much does China emit? How much do the European nations emit? And oddly enough, United States is actually responsible for 25% of CO2 emissions.
Mm-hmm.
If we're looking at that per capita, it's 16.6, which is a lot per like tons of CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is something that we as a nation do you think we can do? Because we're kind of already headed in the direction of green energy, but of course, there is resistance, there is backlash. People like Elon Musk are really pushing for green energy with
Mm-hmm.
Tesla and I would even argue just the fact that in SpaceX he's creating reusable rocket parts, right?
Right. Right.
I feel like if we look at that from a manufacturing perspective, there's a lot less waste in creating new parts if we can somehow master the ability to create reusable parts. So
Yeah.
I guess that could kind of be indirectly correlated. But in terms of what we can do as a nation, what do you think the next steps should be?
Yeah. So one of the biggest ways to tackle climate change, there's the first kind of discussion is mitigation. What are forms of mitigation? So, like you said, with the Elon Musk example, green tech, solar power, wind power, all these different forms of energy production that are deemed clean with respect to the burning of fossil fuels like coal or other petroleum products. So that's one way that I think people are willing and accepting of, and that's something that a lot of states within the United States, we're both from California, we kind of have a taste of this idea of green energy. California is the leader, I would say, probably definitely in the United States, if not the world, in adopting green energy and enforcing different policies that promote the use of green energy or zero emission vehicles and things like that. So that's one way that I think we're trying to step forward into this idea of mitigating the amount of carbon dioxide that's entering our atmosphere. There's also the idea of a circular economy where we're still generating and producing as much as we do now, but without dumping all of this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what does that look like? There's all these different models. And so a lot of it is energy, but there's also a lot of different ways that we're emitting CO2. You mentioned one, also manufacturing. That emits a lot of greenhouse gases, specifically concrete and asphalt production. That's very greenhouse gas intensive. Metallurgy, super greenhouse gas intensive. Surprisingly enough, though, and it's something I just recently learned about because my whole thing was like, whoa, Tesla's like leading the game with this. Like Elon Musk has got it like right. But actually, surprisingly enough, the most greenhouse gases are emitted through livestock production. So it's not transportation, not industrial activities, it's livestock. So that is through the use of land and what that means in terms of carbon sequestration. So instead of having a bunch of rainforests or things like that, we have a bunch of just farmland that has no trees, that's very limited in its ability to absorb CO2 into the plant matter. But also we have cows. Actually, this is going to sound funny. They fart and poop, and that releases a lot of methane gas. And methane gas is actually 14 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, meaning that when it's emitted, the sun rays pass by the CO2 and or methane and other greenhouse gases. Well, when those sun rays hit the methane, they're 14 times better at reflecting it back into Earth than CO2 is. So you see that there's an issue not only in the land use and the amount of water and energy it takes to breed a cow or a pig or whatever it is, but also the animals themselves through their production process. them eating and pooping are producing a very potent greenhouse gas. And so that has actually been shown to be about 14% of the reason, I guess, climate change is occurring, which is mind-boggling. And so now we talk about, okay, we're making impacts in the industries of energy production, and manufacturing. We're looking at green buildings, green this, green that, and that's great. And we need to be pushing forward on those topics. But actually, what we also need to be pushing for is the reduction in people eating livestock. So pigs, chickens, cows, all these things that are staples, especially in the American diet, need to be significantly reduced. And so there's some companies, like I'm sure you've heard of Impossible and Beyond, that are making substitute meats that taste like meat, but they're made of plant matter. And so that's kind of the next step in terms of mitigating the amount of CO2 that's entering, or methane in the case of cows, entering the atmosphere, which I think will be much more difficult than, you know, encouraging people to buy a Tesla, which it looks super cool, it's got all the features and it's super fast. Now you're telling people that have been eating steaks and hamburgers their whole life, hey, you got to eat this, and it came from a plant. It's going to be a lot more difficult to market, but that's going to be huge in the next step of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, hopefully curbing climate change.
Okay. So, amazing points. So as you were talking, I was actually, so you mentioned the Impossible Burger and basically plant-based meats. I know that's a very weird, like it sounds very weird to say, but plant-based meats. You think those are the future?
Yes. So this is, I mean, I've never had one. Okay, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I'm a meat guy, and I've been researching this ever since I found out about it. And I mean, I've seen it at Burger King too. Like they're out there now. And actually, in Davis, they've opened up a whole new chain. It's a store. I mean, restaurant dedicated towards these vegan, they call them vegan burgers, but really, and see, that's where I think that we're going to have an issue, is when these burgers get marketed as like vegan solutions, or these meats as vegan solutions, because even myself, I have this like notion of being a vegan as like being this ridiculous concept. Really, I think they need to just be marketing as a alternative to meat, or the next step in meat, because really the way these like meats are synthesized from plant matter, it's not like they're grinding up a bunch of plants and making it. It's not a veggie burger, right? They're synthesizing the proteins in a certain way from the plant so that it tastes, looks, and smells like meat. So it's a much different concept. And so when you market it as, oh, look at this vegan burger or this vegan solution, people that are used to eating meat are going to be very turned off by that. But I think it is important, and it should be something that is very highly considered. The thing is that there's so much money and power, and this goes honestly not just for the meat. The meat industry, but also petroleum. That's why you see, the first electric car came out in 1998. I want to say GM made one. It was not efficient whatsoever, but the idea has been around for ages, and now we're just now seeing in like the 20 teens the widespread popularity of the Tesla. So what I'm saying is the money and power in these existing industries is very strong, and it's able to kind of steer the public attention away from these new ideas that are going to benefit. Because if those new ideas benefit, then these existing powers are going to detriment. So when you're looking at the meat industry, it's kind of the same correlation as the petroleum industry with these electric cars. But it definitely, I think, is a possibility, and I'm gonna go out and try these new Impossible or Beyond burgers ASAP, because I really want to know, could I make the switch? And it's not because I am super like, oh, like I'm a vegan or a vegetarian or whatever. Not that that's an issue, but personally, I've always loved meat. So can they sway my opinion and then get me to live a more sustainable lifestyle? That'd be really cool.
I agree. But with that in mind, I think it's also important to note that when you try to synthesize something else to be, so when you try to synthesize something to be something it's not, there's obviously going to be some takeaways, right?
Hmm.
So, I mean, the most obvious is it's not meat. And the second most obvious is it's not animal protein, because that's ultimately what we get from meat, right? We get animal protein. So there was actually a study done regarding these Impossible Burgers to kind of see their safety,
Hmm.
and they did a study with rats. Obviously just like how you would do any animal study.
Right.
So these Impossible Burgers, one of the key ingredients in the protein is actually a derivative from yeast. It's a genetically modified derivative from yeast, and it's called soy leg hemoglobin
Yep.
(SLH).
Heme is
Heme,
the short term for it. Yeah.
heme, yeah. So within this study, they actually noticed that these rats had unexplained changes in weight. So they gained weight. There was changes in their blood, and there was oftentimes inflammation or kidney disease, or even anemia. So a decrease in iron in the blood. So with this in mind, obviously, this was just one study. They have to do more studies to kind of validate these results. But it's interesting because this kind of points us in a direction that how far we may actually be from creating a actual meat substitute that has the same benefits as meat does. So, so I think that's something that should be considered when you're going out. Just keep that in mind. I don't know if it's really significant, the study, but when you're going out grabbing a Impossible Burger from wherever it is, keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, no. So what I was just instantly like, I get what you're saying with that, or what that study is trying to show is that it's not. I think what the consensus like with these is, and I've heard the founder of this company speak on these kind of these research studies and things where they're like, well, if you look at this compared to something, then it's just really bad for you. And he's like, look, this isn't meant to be a kale salad. Like, it's not meant to be this super healthy superfood that's going to be not only cure our environmental crisis, but also provide this end all be all to the issue with eating a hamburger. It's really supposed to be like a burger. That's what it's supposed to be. So I'd be curious if they fed those rats a In-N-Out burger or a McDonald's McDouble at the same consistency, if they would not see the same, if not worse, effects. You know what I'm saying? So I think that there's kind of, you have to take those research with a grain of salt, just because it could be that there's a reason that they're trying to disprove these companies. And at the same time, you got to be wary, definitely. This Impossible or Beyond Meat or whatever company is making these alternatives could not be doing their due diligence in figuring out what the effects are of providing this alternative. So yeah, definitely, it's interesting, but at the same time, like my immediate thought was, well, imagine feeding these rats like In-N-Out every day. You know what I'm saying? Like, it'd probably have the same kind of effects in terms of weight gain and other issues.
That's true. Yeah. So yeah, I would say this study's it's still kind of unsound.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you have to do more studies to see if you can yield the same results. But to kind of steer away from livestock industry
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, and to kind of pull it to modern day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny and interesting. So during this whole coronavirus event that has been gripping the world, really, we have seen, and because of the lockdowns in place, so less cars in the street, less human action happening
Right.
from the
Absolutely.
day to day. We've actually seen some interesting data. We've seen CO2 emissions have been significantly reduced in nations that they were otherwise very high. I mean, I feel like that's pretty obvious because less cars means less emission, or in the case of Europe, less buses, less trains, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, dolphins entered the canals in, I think, Vienna
Yeah, I
for
saw that.
or not Vienna. Was it what?
Venice.
Venice. There
Yeah,
we go.
Venice. Yeah.
Venice. In the waters there, and we actually saw a significant decrease in CO2 emissions from China. China's kind of notorious for having like smog over their cities.
Yep.
And satellite imagery showed, that smog was clearing. So it's obvious that humans, or as you say, there is anthropogenic reason that we are accelerating climate change or the climate. So I fail personally to see the argument against climate change. So, I mean, I guess some of the arguments is that there is no consensus, but 98% of climate scientists agree that we are accelerating climate change.
Right.
They say that, oh, well, climate changes irregardless of human interaction. Sure. But we are significantly increasing. We are adding fuel to the fire of what climate change is. I mean, if you look at a study that was done, you collect ice caps, right? Mm-hmm. And then you carbon date, and they have been carbon dated. They basically date back to when, this carbon, correct me if I'm wrong, this carbon atom was around, right? Like if it was if you carbon date a fossil, for example, you can tell the fossil is from 1 million years ago or whatever,
right?
Based on the contents of the fossil, right?
Yeah. So the carbon deteriorates. It's called what is it called? I mean, it's called carbon dating, but there's a reason that you can carbon date. It has something to do with like the way the atom, like, what is that called?
You're talking about the half-life?
There it is, half-life. It's the half-life of the carbon molecule. So then you can measure the amount of time that's been around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've carbon dated ice caps, and they found that the carbon in the atmosphere now is almost similar to when Earth was experiencing, insane amounts of literal climate, to the point where it was uninhabitable by humans.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to see the argument that how we are not responsible. I think it's more so if it's going to happen, it'll happen. We won't be around for that, and I feel like that's a very kind of disingenuous way, because like people from that were born in like the 70s or 60s or 50s, they won't be here that much longer. So they won't have to pay the consequences of what their generation was responsible for.
Right.
So, well, what are some arguments that you would say that you've heard against climate change that have some that are kind of sound? Have you heard any specifically?
I mean, so the most sound one that I think you already presented is that the climate fluctuates by itself. But if you look at any, respectable like research group or individual, and you look at the data that they're presenting, you can tell that that's just simply not the case here. There's trends that are graphed. I'm even looking at one now from climate.gov. And it shows the model average if there was no anthropogenic activity. And yes, it fluctuates, but the amount of fluctuation is, in terms of temperature, is minuscule compared to the amount that we're seeing from our activities. So that one I feel like can get shot down pretty easily. I remember reading, I think in my air pollution course, they sent out a list of the different state counterarguments to climate change. And I do not recall all of the different counterarguments, but I would just say if you look at any form of of data regarding this topic. And then if you just think about it logically, right? Like, I don't know, I'm a big fan of just like looking at a situation logically. You have millions and millions and millions of years of life, right? And that's carbon being put into the ground, and it's compacted over time, and it gets turned, because of the pressure, it gets turned into liquid or coal. And then you have a species of animals that rapidly brings that up, like unprecedented amount of that carbon is being brought up and burned and spit into the atmosphere. I just don't, like, logically it doesn't make sense to me that you would think that wouldn't cause a change in the way that the Earth system is working. You know what I mean? Like, just
Right. Yeah.
logically. Like, I don't know. That's just me, but I guess like
Yeah.
maybe some people don't like to think logically. I mean, another thing is, I listened to a speech by Greta Thunberg. She was like the hot topic of 2019. That seems so long ago now.
I know.
She
Jesus Christ.
Isn't that crazy? It seems like years ago. Anyways, she was talking about how, when she's telling her grandchildren about how we knew that climate change was like happening and we did nothing about it, her grandchildren were like, what was wrong with you? Why did you not do anything? And the thing is too, the crazy part is it's not like we don't have the technology or the knowledge or the capability to do something now, like literally now. It's that we have politicians, leaders that don't want to, because it's going to upset very powerful people, or it's going to change the way they view the world, or it's going to make them look dumb because they made false claims in the past. So it's not that we don't have the ability to do it. It's that we're just choosing not to do anything, which is just, I don't know. It's crazy. But
I agree. Yeah. What I wanted to actually touch up on regarding climate change. So it's like, okay, cool, the climate is changing. So what the hell does that mean?
Right.
What is going to happen? And I think a lot of people, there have been movies, obviously, like 2012, and then what was the other one? I don't know if San Andreas. Have you seen San Andreas, the earthquake movie?
no.
Okay, so yeah, something happened with the San Andreas fault line, and there was like massive earthquakes. We'll just use 2012. You've seen 2012, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the Hollywoodized version of what would happen if climate suddenly changed.
Mhm.
Obviously, that's, again, Hollywood.
Yeah.
But it gives you an idea of what the world would look like. So, for example, to begin, one of the crises that we will experience if climate does change is a huge global refugee crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the world is already experiencing a big refugee crisis.
Right.
Now, if the sea levels rose more than 11 feet, that would obviously significantly affect coastal cities,
Right.
places like New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, and cities of the like. They would be completely submerged in water.
Mm-hmm.
That would cause a massive refugee crisis.
Oh, yeah.
And it is actually predicted that there could be more than 2 billion climate change refugees by the year 2100.
That's nuts.
And 1.4 billion by 2060. 2060 is within you and I's lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
So this is a very serious thing to consider. Another thing, aside from the massive hurricanes and weather change, sure, but then economies would be destroyed. Mm-hmm. Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
How many cities have economic hubs and infrastructures at their coasts?
A lot.
Well, how much would you? A lot, exactly. Those would be submerged. They would be destroyed.
Yep.
We would lose trillions and trillions of dollars on a worldwide economic scale.
Yeah, think about like the boating infrastructure, all the ports and things that are just going to go underwater. You're not. I mean, that's going to have to all be rebuilt. So it's funny because people just like dismiss it as, oh, the sea level will rise. Well, if you live on the coast, you'll just move inland. That's not like that's literally not how it works in any way, shape, or form. You know what I mean? Like,
Exactly.
it's not just like,
Exactly.
oh, we'll just move inland. You have literal refugees, people that no longer have a home because it's underwater. I mean, you see it now. Like, there's literally like videos. I think it was the last time Miami like flooded. It was nuts. Like, there was like 3 feet of water in downtown Miami. Like, and people still have the audacity to be like, "Oh, like it's fine. Like, this is a normal thing." Like, what?
Yeah.
Like,
It's
that's an
insane.
epicenter, and it's going to be like underwater, and people just want to pretend like it's not happening or it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah,
But
no, like we will lose Miami.
oh
We
yeah.
will lose most of Florida if this happens. And on top of that, that's just one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, it's like, okay, economy goes bad, we lose a few cities, so what? Okay, what about food? What about water? What about resources? If
Yeah.
if we lose a lot of these coastal regions and these coastal infrastructures, how do we make trades? Where will we get certain materials to produce certain things?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like we're going to, like, just think Fukushima in Japan, right?
Yeah.
What happened when that reactor uh, melted down? There's still traces of radioactive material in the ocean today.
Right.
So imagine all the reactors that are near coastal, cities.
Which I think almost all of them are because they need a
They
cooling
need
source.
water.
Yeah.
So, exactly. So what happens when all those melt down and become submerged? How much radiation would leak into the ocean? How many species would die because of that?
I mean,
Of sea creatures.
right. I
A
mean,
lot.
that's catastrophic events. I mean, we're already seeing, levels of ocean acidification that are killing off species. I mean, if you look at the coral reefs are dying because of ocean acidification, which is a direct result of climate change. And so that entire ecosystem could potentially just be wiped out because of global warming. And I want to kind of go back to, the sea levels rising. I think a common misconception is that the glaciers are melting, and then that's waters entering the ocean, and then that's causing the sea levels to rise. Actually, floating glaciers can melt all they want, and that won't cause the sea levels to rise because the volume of water that's displaced by the glacier is the same volume that would be melted water. So what's actually happening is the permafrost land, specifically in the Arctic Circle, is melting, and that whatever's on the land that enters the water is now added volumes of water, and that will contribute to sea level rise. On top of that, stored inside that permafrost is massive amounts of carbon. So when that permafrost melts, it releases carbon dioxide, which then adds to the problem. So you have this vicious cycle. On top of that, when the permafrost is white, it's like snow, ice. So there's this topic called albedo, which is like the reflectivity of a substance. So when the sun comes down and hits the surface of the earth and it's white, it bounces back up, and only a percentage of it gets bounced back by the greenhouse gases. When you melt permafrost and that substance is now not white, but it's some brown, let's say the earth beneath it's brown, that heat is now getting absorbed by the earth. So that's adding more heat to the system. So you're seeing this like vicious cycle where as we melt permafrost, it becomes more of an issue than just, we added water to the ocean. We're actually adding CO2, which is causing more permafrost to melt, which is decreasing the albedo, which is introducing more heat into the Earth system. So it really is kind of this like snowball effect. And so a lot of climate scientists will talk about 400 ppm, which is 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, is kind of considered the tipping point where no matter how much mitigation we do, it's to the point that things are going to drastically change unless we start removing CO2 from the air. And so according to most climate scientists, we've already achieved that. I think the last I heard was like 415 ppm. So there's 400 molecules of CO2 per million molecules of air in the atmosphere. So now it's not only do we need to do all these things to mitigate the amount of CO2 we're introducing into the atmosphere, which we've only done a little bit of, we now need to work on technologies or methods to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. Some of the most primitive forms of doing so are reforestation, afforestation, forest rehabilitation. Those are things where we're introducing trees, which are carbon sequestering life forms, that will reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, that won't be enough because we've burned up millions of years of carbon and pumped it in the atmosphere. So we're going to have to do more than plant some trees. But that's kind of where we're headed. And I guess kind of what we can talk about next is forms of fixing our dire situation.
Yeah, we could do that. We can do that because right before we do, I do think it's important to also note that that if we don't do this, aside from everything that we've already discussed on the effects of what climate change could cause.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually mentioned something I really wanted to touch up on, is about like, ice caps and permafrost melting, right?
Right.
It's important, especially for us humans, right? We saw what one strain of virus can do to an entire species, an entire, on a global scale.
Right.
In the Tibetan glaciers, scientists discovered 28 never before seen groups of virus families. 28. These viruses have been locked in these ice glaciers for hundreds, thousands, if not millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Before humans even existed, before most things existed that exist now.
Right.
That's 28, and that's in one area, just the Tibetan glaciers.
That's nuts.
Imagine how many viral families, how many bacterial families are locked away in Antarctica or in the Arctic Circle, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when those are released? Sure, this could sound like fear mongering, but I think it's important to consider worst case scenarios, right? This is just one virus. This SARS-CoV-2, it's just one strain of something that we do have. Luckily, we have an understanding of which is SARS, right? So we can kind of trace back and at least have some idea of what we're dealing with. Right. These are just in Tibet, 28 never before seen viral families to modern science. So we have absolutely no idea what they are.
Right. Yeah.
Like these are things that most people don't consider when they hear, climate change. They don't consider things like if mass migrations happen because, refugees, they don't consider things like sanitation diseases like cholera and things like that. Those are going to increase. They're going to increase because there is only so much you can do when there is a massive surge and sudden influx of refugees. Like you can't stay on top of all of it, especially sanitation wise. So things like cholera and sanitation illnesses will increase.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch on those because they're like little things, right? They're little things, but they add up to huge, completely, like literally region changing things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, exactly. That's something that we're going to see in the future and something that people, I think, just want to deny. Even recently, the Paradise Fires, right? That was the most catastrophic wildfire event in U.S. history. So, you and I had to. Were you at Davis at the time?
Yeah.
We had.
Are you talking about campfire?
Yeah, campfire.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, so we couldn't go to class just because of the smoke, right? The particulate matter in the air. But I know some people might blame it on PG&E. That's fine. But the fact of the matter was there was a huge dry season, a huge drought. That was not, a coincidence. That's caused by the change in climate, the fact that there's no moisture in the air, and because global warming and things like that. So that's just something that we see. I mean, it's the most catastrophic fire. We're looking at, what was this, 2018, most catastrophic fire in U.S. history with all the technology, all the resources we have. So it just kind of shows what's kind of waiting for us if we don't do anything, which I guess will segue into what can we do. So on top of all the mitigation things that we've kind of already talked about, we can also look at forms of removal, the planting of trees, and then other forms of carbon sequestration. I'm going to throw one out there that I thought was super cool. Researchers at MIT have been studying this technology, and there was an article published, I think, by BBC, like in the end of 2019. Basically, it's a battery that gets charged up, and as it's charging, it reacts with carbon dioxide in the air. There's a form of molecules in there that, when they're electrically excited, they react with CO2. So as it's charged up, it's sucking up CO2 from the air directly, and then it is putting that CO2, storing it inside the battery. So then when you go discharge the battery, the CO2 is released. In that case, you would have to limit the CO2 being emitted into the air, you would want to pump it into the ground. So you have these batteries being, releasing their energy in a closed container, and then discharging the CO2 underground. Well, that's what a lot of forms of carbon sequestration, kind of the idea of them is to take the CO2 out of the ground and then put it back into the earth, just as it was already before we decided to burn it for energy. Other forms of carbon sequestration include putting it into the ocean. That will cause ocean acidification. However, the impact of ocean acidification on humanity would probably be less than overall climate change. So that's just a couple things to think about in terms of solving the issue or removing CO2 from the air. I think that's going to be a huge topic, by the way, like carbon sequestration in the next 10, 15 years.
So the main goal here is to remove the carbon from the atmosphere, right?
Right.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So actually in Switzerland, they developed this giant machine that is basically sucking carbon directly out of the air. Mm-hmm. And I know there's like this whole what is it? It's like a concept where they put these giant vents on the side of buildings that kind of like suck, carbon and then emit oxygen or whatever from the other end.
Yeah.
But for this one specifically, it's set, the plant is set to, this was in 2017, by the way. The plant is set to remove 900 tons of CO2 annually. And that's approximately the same level of how much carbon is released by 200 cars annually.
Okay.
So, I mean, I would say that's a pretty big deal. I mean, if this, if this happens, or if it is happening, and you multiply this on, you have 10 plants, 20 plants, 30 plants, I think that's a huge step. With that said, is carbon dioxide necessarily bad?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you could ask this about anything, is water bad? It could be bad if you drink too much of it in too short of an amount of time, right? So
right, yeah. So I guess the better question is some carbon good? I guess that should be the right question to ask.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a balance. It's a complex system, but there is a balance between the amount of carbon that would be too little. And I mean, without carbon, there's no trees. Without trees, there's no oxygen. Everything is in a balance, right? What we're doing is throwing off that balance, and we're getting it to the point where there's not going to be enough there's not going to be enough carbon sinks for there to be to pick up all the carbon that we're emitting into the air. So that's kind of the issue. It's like it's literally a tipping. It's a balance. It's at a tipping point. I mean, you can imagine like literally like a beam on a lever, and it's tipping, but you could eventually it can go back to equilibrium, right? But we're getting to the point now where it's going to tip all the way, and the beam's just going to fly off, and then we're all in trouble. So carbon inherently isn't bad. It's just a molecule. CO2 is just a molecule. Carbon, technically, the term carbon, that's the building block of life. Everything is made of carbon. Anything living is made of carbon. CO2 is just a byproduct of respiratory systems, photosynthesis. It's used in photosynthesis. It's just a molecule. However, is a molecule that also will act as a greenhouse gas by blocking UV rays from leaving the Earth's system. So in that way, I guess it is bad because there's too much of it, because we're burning up dead animals from millions of years ago at an insane rate.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, CO2 ultimately, it keeps the Earth warm. And if there was no CO2, I'm assuming we would enter an ice age, right?
Oh yeah.
So I guess
more than that, ice age, it would just be like frozen,
like a ball of ice.
It'd be like, yeah, exactly. It would just be. I mean, we have to have greenhouse gases. That's another thing is, yeah. I think it's very important to point out that greenhouse gases are very good. That's why we're here. Like it wouldn't be, if it weren't for greenhouse gases, we'd all be in trouble. But we're making too much of it to the point where it's going to get too hot in here, and we're all going to have to figure out something else to do. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like we obviously this was, and in a 47-minute episode, you can only really cover so much, right? Mm-hmm. This is literally less than one lecture at a university. In a university course, right? It's only maximum. This episode is going to be 50 minutes, whatever. So, but I feel like we touched on a lot of important things, and I hope that the listeners. I mean, I definitely walked away with more information than I knew before, but I hope the listeners also take into consideration like what the actual effects are. Right. Yes, we are doing all of these things, as you mentioned, but a lot of people, they kind of miss. Okay, so we're doing this, but what's going to happen? And I hope people take into consideration and hopefully change the way their behavior, like you mentioned, with livestock and the food and the meat industry. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important thing. Obviously, you and I both, we love to eat animal meat, right. But for the betterment of humanity, I think there could always be, you can always sacrifice some things for the betterment of a entire, people.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I have to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say there's a couple things I want to say regarding the accepting that climate change is here. It's an issue. And if we don't do anything, there's going to be some very drastic consequences. One, when we hear climate change and we begin to understand it, that's just the first step of the process, right? We hear all this bad news about climate change. Well, our mind's immediately going to go, okay, I don't want to really think about that anymore, pretend like it's not happening. Or we're going to think, that's like 200 years in the future. I'm not going to be here anyways. Well, fact of the matter is, if you have children or grandchildren, they're probably going to be here and they're going to wonder why we didn't do anything. Also, a lot of people will try to come up with these kind of counter arguments that we've already discussed. I would just say that it's important as we begin to look at climate change that we really take it seriously and don't think of it as a problem of tomorrow, but a problem of today. There's only so much left that we can do, and it needs to be done. Otherwise, we're going to lead to the end of humanity as we know it, at least. There was important steps that were made, such as the Paris Agreement, which was the largest international agreement of all time. 196 countries agreed to what was called national NDCs. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but there were basically national conditions that they were going to aim towards in regards to mitigating climate change. So that was a huge step. If you follow politics, or if you don't, our administration now in the US decided to back out of that. Don't want to get political, but we can see how this concept of climate change not being real or not being important enough can have huge implications. So I just urge any of the listeners to take it seriously, and really evaluate what you can do within your life, whether that be activism, whether that be just talking about it with your friends, posting on social media, changing your lifestyle in any way, doing whatever you can to kind of fight against this topic that is climate change. And I think that will conclude the experiment.